Our speaker is Dr. Patel, and he is a cardiologist at Massachusetts General Hospital focused on multimodal cardiovascular risk prediction. He graduated from the Yale University School of Medicine and completed clinical training in internal medicine and cardiology at Massachusetts General Hospital. His current research focuses on integrating genetics, biomarkers, and race or ethnicity into disease prediction, with a particular interest in understanding cardiovascular risk among South Asian individuals.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for the introduction. So I will be speaking a little bit more about the research that I'm doing in terms of heart disease in South Asians, as well as what we can do about it in terms of preventing it and as a group in terms of researching it further. Okay, so no disclosures. So just to get started, I think it's important to understand what we're talking about when we say heart disease or coronary artery disease. And so the heart has three main blood vessels that supply it. And the blood vessels supply the muscle so that the muscle can contract and the heart can beat. And so these blood vessels themselves, within them is where heart disease or coronary artery disease happens. And over the course of life, when someone has high cholesterol, they smoke, they have high blood pressure, or they have high blood sugar in the case of diabetes, all these things damage the blood vessel lining and they form these little blockages or plaque. And the plaque can rupture, get bigger, and form a blood clot to the point where blood doesn't flow through the artery anymore, and then the person has a heart attack. So that part of the heart is not getting enough blood in it, and it either dies or is scarred. And so the whole goal of kind of cardiology is to help prevent this process from happening. So that's what coronary artery disease is. And just as background, the term South Asian refers to people who have genealogic ancestry tracing back to the Indian subcontinent. With over about a century of migration, people from South Asia have come to live in different corners of the world. And with this movement, epidemiologists or people who study different diseases around the world have noted that people who are South Asian have higher rates of heart disease compared to other groups living in the area. So a number of studies have looked into this, starting with one which compared heart attack rates and ages in different countries. And one of these was the InterHeart study, where they noted that people who lived in India had their first heart attack on average at the age of 53, versus if you look at the average age of all the other countries that they studied, the average was 59. So it was much younger people were having heart attacks in India. In Singapore, they looked at autopsies of patients who had died. And when they compared South Asians compared to native or other Chinese or Singaporean populations, South Asians had 4 times as much heart disease noted on the autopsy studies. In Spain, they noted that women, if you just study Catalonian or Spanish women compared to South Asian women had 3.5 rates of heart disease compared to the Spanish women. And even in California, there's been studies that have looked at South Asians compared to all other ethnic groups in the area, including Hispanics, African ancestry, European ancestry, and South Asians have 2.4 to 3-fold increased risk of heart attacks. And so with all of this data that's been gathered over the past 30 years, the American Heart Association and the American College of Cardiology have made South Asian ancestry as a whole something called a risk-enhancing factor. Which is a term that I can talk a little bit more about. So what is a risk enhancing factor and how is it used? So normally when someone goes to see their primary care doctor, we try or their cardiologist, we try to figure out what is your risk of developing heart disease. And so we plug in, your age, your gender, your blood pressure, cholesterol level, all these things into this calculator. And it spits out a risk, whether it's low, intermediate, or high, based on all these things added up together. And depending on if you're low, we may just recommend some continued exercise and health measures. If you're intermediate, it may be exercise plus or minus some medications like cholesterol lowering medicine. If you're high, we may definitely do both. So what we found that is that when you're in this intermediate category, it's harder to know what to really do with these patients. Like, do you start them on the medicine or not? And so things that are designated a risk enhancing factor, like South Asian ancestry. So if you're in this intermediate group, we bump you into the higher group and say, okay, you actually should be on a statin, even though you're otherwise at intermediate risk. But although this has made it into the guidelines that South Asians as a whole ancestry are a risk enhancing factor, that's still kind of a severe statement to say that a whole group of people are at high risk. And so we wanted to study that a little bit more scientifically. So one was how exactly how much higher risk are South Asians for heart attack compared to everyone else. And all the calculators that we've used for calculating risk don't include South Asians in their derivation, so they don't really apply. The second piece was, is that increased risk that was noted 20, 30 years ago still present today? Where everyone has kind of access to better healthcare, blood pressure control, cholesterol control. And to what degree is that extra risk just explained by known risk factors? So is it just that South Asians have more diabetes or have more high blood pressure or something, and that's why they have more heart attacks? So we wanted to study this further. So we did a study within the UK Biobank, which is a group of about 500,000 individuals. And within this biobank, although it's mostly white individuals, there were about 8,000 South Asian individuals that had registered to be part of this biobank. And that's actually a very large number for us to be able to study and answer this sort of question. So we compared the 8,000 or so South Asian individuals at the biobank with about 450,000 European ancestry individuals. And we looked for people who never had a heart attack before. So we excluded people who didn't have heart attacks or strokes. We followed them for about 11 years, and we asked, like, how many of these people developed a heart attack or stroke in that follow-up time. And so over about 12 years of follow-up, South Asians had twice as many heart attacks and strokes as Europeans. So in this chart, the x-axis shows follow-up time in years. The y-axis shows the incidence of disease, so from 0 to 9%. And the red is indicating South Asians, the blue indicates Europeans. And so over about 12 years, South Asians were having twice as many heart attacks and strokes as Europeans. Now, going back to that calculator that I talked about, when you go to see the primary care doctor or the cardiologist, but what did they use to calculate someone's risk? If we ran that calculator on all these individuals and plotted a plot of like how the distributions look for people who are South Asian versus Europeans, but the calculator essentially says that both groups are essentially the same amount of risk. So even though South Asians have twice as much heart attacks as European ancestry individuals, the way we predict risk for heart attacks says that both groups are the same. Essentially saying that the way we predict or think about heart attack risk is not accurate and it doesn't work well. We next went on to see, can we explain away this extra risk if we account for different risk factors that may be higher or lower in South Asian versus European ancestry individuals? And so in order to do that, we do this project called adjustment, where we look at the relationship between South Asian versus European and then heart attack risk, and then we add in other variables to the equation to see if that relationship gets weaker, aka can we explain away that extra risk? So when you add in blood pressure, diabetes, kidney function, that the strength of that association goes from twice as high risk down to about 1.5-fold higher risk, so about 50% higher risk. Then if you add in all these other emerging risk factors, as well as cholesterol, as well as more socioeconomic and lifestyle factors like diet, smoking, psychosocial status, all that doesn't really make that much of a difference. And at the end, after accounting for all of these things, South Asians are still about a 50% higher risk of heart attack or stroke compared to European ancestry individuals. So we then decided to delve a little bit deeper into the specific risk factors that go into heart disease risk. And so the main one that is of concern is diabetes. So diabetes is where someone's body has trouble handling blood sugar. And normally when you eat and you digest food, you absorb the blood sugar, your tissues absorb it, and that's that. But in patients with diabetes, the blood sugar levels stay high, and that blood sugar can damage the arteries of the heart and all the other blood vessels and cause problems. And so we found that within this UK Biobank, South Asians had 4 times as much diabetes as individuals of European ancestry. So about 1 in 5 South Asians in the UK Biobank had diabetes, whereas only 1 in 20 did for the European individuals. We also looked at people who developed diabetes without obesity. So traditionally, type 2 diabetes happens in people who are obese because the extra kind of fat that people carry makes their body more likely to develop diabetes. But what we saw is that in South Asians, about 70% of the individuals actually developed diabetes even without being obese. So despite being skinny, they were still diabetic, which was a little puzzling. And then we saw that among the people who had diabetes, if you were South Asian, you were more likely to have uncontrolled diabetes. That means the sugars were very high and they were not being controlled by the medications that the patients were started on. Another thing we looked at was something called the waist-hip ratio. This has been associated with cardiovascular disease risk. And what a waist-to-hip ratio is the ratio of the circumference around someone's waist, which is a little bit around the navel or the belly button, and then the hip, which is further down. And so if your waist is bigger than your hip, then you have kind of a round body shape. We call that the apple shape, which is more harmful in terms of the cardiovascular risk perspective. And then if the waist is narrower than the hip, like in this person, that's a healthier phenotype. We call that the pear body shape. So what we found is that across the board, South Asians had a higher waist to hip ratio. So their waists were bigger than their hips more so, meaning that imparted higher risk from that perspective. And having a high waist to hip ratio was associated with about 60% increased risk of cardiovascular disease in both Europeans and in South Asians, except it was more common in South Asians to have this kind of body type. Another thing we looked at was something called lipoprotein A. So lipoprotein A is a special type of lipid particle. So it's in the family of things like triglyceride, cholesterol, like HDL, LDL, but it's a different type of molecule, and it's unique in that it varies a lot between what kind of ethnic or race group you are. And so, for example, in European individuals, the mean average concentration of LPA is about 19, whereas in South Asians, it's 31. So that's significantly higher. And then in African ancestry individuals, it's even higher than that. And so lipoprotein A as a particle is associated with higher rates of heart attack, stroke. It also is associated with blood clot, it's associated with aortic valve disorder. So it's a lot of different cardiovascular things are linked to it. And overall, South Asians have higher levels of it, just genetically. And if you look at lipoprotein A risk across the spectrum, starting from 0 all the way to 400, the higher lipoprotein A you have, the higher rate of cardiovascular disease you have. And so already South Asians are almost 30% higher, and so therefore they're going to have a higher risk as a result of this. And across both groups, having a higher LPA here, having a cutoff above 150 was associated with higher risk of cardiovascular disease. There isn't currently an active medicine that treats lipoprotein A, but there is one in development in clinical trials. So there may be more to come in this story in the future. We also looked at diet in terms of contrasting dietary patterns between European and South Asian ancestry individuals. This is really hard to do because the questions that were asked were very Western diet centric. And so a lot of them didn't apply to what South Asian diets look like, but it was still interesting to kind of see in broad categories, what are these two groups eating? And as you can see across the board, here on the left, I'm showing you different categories of what we consider healthy eating. So having less than 1 serving or so of meat, especially less than 2 servings or so of red meat, few starches, having more fish, having more grain, having more vegetables, having more fruit. And overall, South Asians and Europeans had fairly similar dietary patterns, at least in the UK Biobank. The only place where it kind of stood out was that Europeans were having more whole grains and more fish compared to South Asians. But if you summed up all these things into dietary scores, both essentially had the same diet if you look at their dietary pattern. And so I think more studies needed into specific South Asian diets to better understand this, because at least based on the questions asked, both Europeans and South Asians appear to have similar diets. So, we did this analysis and essentially found that South Asians had twice the risk of heart attack, but we weren't really able to understand why that risk was present. We looked at several different variables, but even after accounting for them, including things like diabetes, lipoprotein A, that they still had about a 50% excess risk that was still there. And so what other things could be driving that higher risk that we haven't thought about? One of them is that there could be some sort of language barrier or discrimination or other things that are limiting healthcare access. That wasn't really studied as part of our study. There could be something else, some sort of other biological risk factor that we're not measuring that has a strong influence in South Asians, but it's hard to say what that would be. And finally, there's the question of, is there something that's more genetically mediated in South Asians versus in Europeans that's not being accounted for, and that's explaining that higher risk? And so that prompted us to do some more digging into kind of genetic causes of heart disease and how we could use genetics to maybe help predict the increased risk of heart disease in South Asians. So, what have we learned from what have we learned about the genetic drivers of cardiovascular disease in South Asians, but more broadly, genetic drivers of heart disease, period? So to review the basics, it's important to kind of go back down to the building blocks of life. And so that is essentially DNA. So humans have about 3 billion base pairs. So a base pair is a pairing of these chemical letters right here. And when you look at all of these in sequence across all of your DNA, that's your genetic code. And so humans have about 3 billion of these base pairs that make up their DNA. And groups of these base pairs make up genes. And so genes then encode proteins that then tell your body how to make different structures and essentially carry out the functions of life. So the body has 3 billion base pairs, 20,000 of these genes. And if you look at one human versus another human and look at all their DNA in terms of comparing and contrasting the difference between two humans, 99.9% of all these bases are the same between any two given people. It's that last 0.1% of these bases will be different based on one individual versus another. And that small amount of difference is what explains why all of us are so different. So it's kind of remarkable that just a small amount of variation in genetics can explain all the diversity that we see in humans. And in fact, if you actually stretched out all of these base pairs, but the 3 billion base pairs in a row, it would stretch out to about 6 feet long. And all of this is munched up into the nucleus of a cell. In each cell of your body, you have all this DNA. And your body has about 30 trillion of these cells that make up all of you. So that's a lot of DNA, a lot of cells. And all of that collectively makes up any given human. So how do we look at how a given base pair mutation or genetic change can lead to some sort of disease or trait? That's a big jump to make from going to something that's so small to something that's so big. So the way we do this is something called a genome-wide association study. So we identify people with a given disease. So in our case, it would be heart attack. We also identify people without that disease. So in our case, no heart attack. And so the blue are people with heart attack. Red is with heart attack, blue is without heart attack. We then sequence all the people's in these groups. We look at their DNA sequences. And then we count all the different variants that they have at each of those sites, and we compare for a given site, do they have A or do they have G? Do they have T or do they have C? And what we find is that for some very specific bases, more of them are higher or found more often in people with disease than without disease. And then we say that given mutation or that given variant is associated with disease. And so in order to do this, we need large amounts of people to be able to make that level of statistical claim. Now, what has been done in South Asians? To this date, there's been about 2 studies that were published about 10 years ago. Both one was for coronary artery disease and one was for diabetes. Both had about 20 to 30,000 South Asians as part of the sample size where they looked at for this sort of association study. That may sound like a big number, but because we're looking at so many base pairs that have such small effects, this actually is a tiny number. And so these studies that have been done to date in South Asia specifically have not identified a specific gene or specific mutation that's different or driving disease in South Asians versus Europeans. Now, if you compare that to the level of genetic studies that have been done in all people, so the largest coronary artery disease GWAS of this sort that has been has about 1.2 million people. So 1.2 million people across the world for studying this, and that's revealed more helpful information. Whereas the 20,000 people that were in that study about 10 years ago, although it was negative, I would say it's not negative, it was inconclusive. Taking that further, if you look at all of these sorts of genome-wide association studies that have been done, and you group the study population based on their ethnicity, starting from the first Genomewide Association study all the way till now, what you find is that the majority of people are European ancestry. So blue designates European, red is South Asian, and these other colors are the other groups. So starting from the beginning all the way till now, Europeans make up the vast majority of these Genomewide Association studies, and South Asians make up this tiny sliver, even though in the global population, South Asians make up over a quarter of the global population. So why is this important? Is because, again, going back to that Genomewide Association study where you look at where the different variants kind of are in disease versus non-disease, all that is shaped by evolution, where people are within the world, and what their genetics, their baseline, genetics that lead to their ethnic diversity are. And so when you're using, because when we use mainly genetic data that's been derived from European populations, it's hard to apply those same conclusions to all these other groups. And so that poses a problem. Now, how do we use all the information from these sorts of genetic studies to get at risk prediction or causality of risk? So the general model that you may learn in school is that having one mutation leads to a big effect, and that's what we see. So the classic examples are like Mendel's peas, where you have a single mutation that turns a pea from green to yellow, or vice versa. But what we know in human disease, particularly with more complex things like heart disease or diabetes, is that one single gene isn't going to turn on heart attack or no heart attack. What we found is that actually it's the added effect of many, many genes that have very small effects. If you add all that together, that leads to what these complex disorders are. And that's why it's actually harder to say, is it genetic or not, because it's a very complex picture. So what we did was we designed something called a polygenic score, where we added up the effects of each of these small different mutations that we find. And we say, like, if you have all these mutations added up, this is what your score is, and every person would have a different score. We did that using the most recent data sets with Genomewide Association studies with having lots of South Asians in them. And so the score that we created was the one in red. We then tested it and compared it to other similar scores that have been calculated before us, that were calculated mainly based on European populations. We applied this in African ancestry, European ancestry, Hispanic, and South Asian ancestry. And across all four groups, our score actually outperformed all the other prior scores. But then if you look in the South Asian ancestry study, our score not only outperformed all the others, but overall, the genetic score alone had a stronger association with risk compared to all the other ancestry. So we thought that was kind of promising, that we're able to use genetics to predict the higher degree of risk that we're seeing in South Asia. We then went on to combine the genetic risk with all the clinical variables like cholesterol, diabetes, smoking, blood pressure, and made a combined score. And when we applied that combined score, and we kind of plotted it for different ancestries, where here green is South Asian and these other groups are down here. With the combination of genetics and both the clinical risk factors, we were able to re-demonstrate that South Asians actually do have the highest risk of heart disease compared to the other groups. And so that kind of gives promise in that an integrated approach where you use both genetics as well as clinical risk factors can be more useful, particularly in predicting the higher risk that's seen in South Asia. So what does this mean, though, looking forward? Just because a group may have a higher genetic predisposition to disease, like, does that mean that that's it? There's nothing else to do? The answer to that is no. DNA actually is not destiny. And so a study looked into this question a few years ago. So this graph on the left shows you individuals that are binned according to their genetic risk. So genetic risk being having a low, intermediate, or high polygenic risk score, calculated from all those variants that I talked about. So here I'm only showing you people in the high genetic risk group. And among those people in the high genetic risk group, we looked at people, we group people based on their lifestyle being healthy, intermediate, or unhealthy. And healthy lifestyle is defined as having no smoking, no obesity, having regular physical activity, and a healthy diet. And then an unhealthy lifestyle having less than 2 of those, and then intermediate having at least 2 of those. What this is showing is that even among individuals who have high genetic risk, if you have a healthy lifestyle versus an unhealthy lifestyle, a healthy lifestyle decreases your risk of having heart disease by 48%. So although you're at high risk overall, enacting these four things of, not smoking, healthy diet and exercise, and then having a healthy weight can reduce your risk substantially to almost to the rate of the regular population. So you can offset any high risk that you may have. Similarly, that was lifestyle. What about medication? So this was a analysis that was done in a clinical trial, about 20,000 people, where here the y-axis is showing event rate, and again it's the same low, intermediate, and high polygenic risk category, except here instead of lifestyle being healthy or unhealthy, the blue group designates people who had placebo, aka no medicine given, and then the red group designates people who had a cholesterol lowering medicine given. And what they found is that over the course of this clinical trial, even in the people with high genetic risk, those who took the medicine had about a 31% reduction in heart attack or stroke compared to those who didn't get the medicine. So here, even if you have high genetic risk, if you have healthy lifestyle, or if you need medicines, both can reduce your risk down to essentially the population norm. So in conclusion, we showed that South Asians are at double risk of heart disease. This risk is not captured by our current clinical risk tools. Some factors like diabetes or abdominal obesity can help explain this, but more work needs to be done. Polygenic risk scores, where you calculate the aggregate risk of all these small little DNA variants, can help understand or predict that extra risk starting at birth, but we need better methods and better scores to be able to do this across different populations. Combining both the clinical risk factors as well as genetic predictors can help capture that extra disparity and extra heart disease risk that we see in South Asians. And having high genetic risk doesn't mean that you're destined to develop the disease. Lifestyle modification and medications can really help offset the risk. So what do we do, practically speaking, moving forward in terms of helping offset that extra risk that South Asians are predisposed to? So the American Heart Association released a list of life's essential 8 recommendations for general heart health in 2022. And I think, so this is meant for the general population, but they definitely apply for the South Asian population. And I think they're a very good way to help understand the concrete ways to reduce cardiovascular risk. And it's important to note that overcoming kind of this sort of heart disease risk isn't going to happen very quickly. It's not going to be a magical pill. It's going to take a lot of effort across all these domains. But collectively, all of these things work synergistically, but it will take effort in terms of doing all these things. So the first recommendation is eat better. So what does that mean? So overall, they recommend eating more fruits, more vegetables, more whole grains, things with more fiber, more lean animal proteins if you're non-vegetarian, and seafood. Limiting excess or added sugar, so no sweetened drinks, alcohol, processed foods, refined carbohydrates, and then avoiding trans fats or partially hydrogenated oils. So if you were to sum all that together, it's essentially saying eat more fiber, eat more protein, and eat less carbs. That's particularly relevant to the South Asian kind of body type, is that the diets tend to be low in protein and fiber and high in carbs, but you essentially need to take steps to counter that and add more fiber, add more protein, and decrease the number of carbs. And in order to do that, one, you have to know how to read a nutrition label. So when looking at a nutrition label, one, be cognizant of what a serving size is. Often it's probably smaller than what you think it is. And that serving size then corresponds to everything down here. And the main categories to look at are calories, total fat, carbohydrates, and then the carbohydrates are broken down into dietary fiber and added sugar. So this is a nutrition label for mung dal, and then protein. So you want things that don't have added sugar, which would be another value here. They're generally low in carbohydrates, high in protein, high in fiber. And then the caloric value can be adjusted based on your daily. And it's important to note that the calories that someone needs is different based on how old you are, if you're a man or a woman, and how tall you are, and what your baseline weight is. So just saying that all people need 2,000 calories is wrong. If you're like 5 foot, you're not going to need 2,000 calories. If you're 6'5", you probably will need more. And so there are a lot of calculators that you can go in and help determine what your caloric requirement would be, and then go from there. But now, so yeah, so how do you fill up a general plate of food to be healthy and help aspire to these sorts of recommendations? And so this is the schematic that's been put forth by myplate.gov, which shows what an ideal meal looks like. So this is not just one meal, but basically all meals should somehow look like this. And this is a step away from the food pyramid, which a lot of you may have grown up with. That was dated back like 10 to 20 years ago. But the My Healthy Plate is how we kind of approach food allocation now. But one thing you should notice is that half the plate is full of fruits and vegetables. Half. A quarter of it, a little bit over a quarter of it is grains, and that would be unrefined grains, so like whole wheat, those sorts of things. A quarter of it is proteins, and then you have a cup of dairy here. And then there's no spot for fats anymore. It's kind of just used sparingly. But the problem is, how do you translate this into South Asian diets? I tried actually looking to see if there's a South Asian version of this, and I couldn't find one. What I did find was this. So this is a picture of a generic vegetarian thali, which is like a Gujarati dish where you have all these foods that are on there. And actually, if you look at any of these foods individually, they're not bad for you. They're actually quite good. They're homemade, they're wholesome, they're healthy. But if you look at the whole picture, what do we see here? So I'm going to color these in. So that's a carb, that's a vegetable, that's some sort of dal. And so dals are not protein. Dals are actually mostly grains. They do have a little bit of protein in them. So that's why I'm giving that a little pie chart of protein. The rest is carb. I think that's a potato and some sort of pea. So I'm going to say that's actually mostly carb and a little bit of vegetable. That's a dal. That's some sort of milk product, which I'll give that as dairy. It's probably sweet. Carb. That's a vegetable. So if you add all that up, majority of this plate is actually orange or grain. Very little is vegetable, even though this is technically a vegetarian plate, and a very tiny bit is protein. So yes, although at baseline, each of those items, none of those are actually unhealthy for you, the way it's balanced is actually unbalanced. And so how do you improve that? You would get rid of a lot of these carbs, increase the number of dals, maybe add some cheese or tofu or some more proteinaceous items, and then definitely fill half the tray with vegetables or fruits or greens or something. There's no greens. So that's just something to reflect on, or what does your daily plate look like? And is it more like this or is it more like that? Next is being more active. So the AHA recommends either 150 minutes of moderate physical activity or 75 minutes of vigorous physical activity. So moderate could be walking, gardening, or social dancing. Vigorous could be something like swimming, running, jump rope, things where you're more aerobic. And so one thing that I recommend to my patients is that after every meal, walk for 10 minutes. If you walk for 10 minutes after every meal, as you digest the food, and all the blood sugar, all the carbohydrates and all that are being digested going into your bloodstream, when you go for a walk, you essentially sop all that extra sugar up into your muscles and prevent your blood sugar from spiking. And if you do 10 minutes after every meal, so breakfast, lunch, dinner, that's 30 minutes a day, and do that for 7 days, that's 210 minutes. You're already surpassing the minimum requirement of walking. And that should be dedicated walking, not I'm going to go to the store and I'm going to count that as part of my walking. So you should do your normal activities, but these 150 of moderate versus 75 of vigorous should be dedicated exercise that you find time for in your daily week. In addition to that, I would actually recommend some degree of weight or resistance training. So this isn't just for youth who are in college or in high school or playing sports. This is for people of all ages, men and women. And the reason why it's important is that historically, at least in the epidemiologic studies that have been done, South Asians generally have lower muscle mass. And when you have lower muscle mass, your ability to sop up all that extra blood sugar in your bloodstream and stuff, that all that balances off between fat and muscle. And as you age, you lose more of whatever baseline muscle you have. So it is important to do some degree of body weight training, whether they be push-ups or lifting things or some sort of weight training or calisthenics to make sure that your muscle and your bone health stay. This isn't to say everyone should be a bodybuilder, but it's just to say that some degree of weight training to help keep your muscles healthy, in addition to the aerobic activity. And all this should be tracked. whether that's on your phone, on some sort of device that you have, or just on a piece of paper saying, I did this much today, I did this much today. And that'll keep you honest in terms of if you're doing enough or if you need to do more and staying committed to it. There's actually a lot of online or free resources where people go through different like habit building things like yoga or walking clubs or other things in the community that you can either start or join. But I think either doing this in groups definitely helps keep up with the accountability. The third recommendation is called managing your blood sugar. So again, let me explain a little bit about how diabetes works and how blood sugar works. Is you digest food, it goes through your stomach. Your food is broken down into its components, including blood sugar. When your body knows that the sugar has entered the bloodstream, you release something called insulin. The insulin makes all the sugar go into your muscles and other tissues. Now, when you have a lot of fat in your body, you develop something called insulin resistance, so that the muscles, although they see the insulin, they don't soak up all this extra blood sugar. What then happens is the blood sugar goes high. When the blood sugar goes high over time in the state of diabetes, that then latches onto the lining of the blood vessels, and that causes heart attacks. It can cause strokes. It can damage your eyes. It can damage your kidneys. It can damage your nerves. It causes neuropathy. So that's the general pathophysiology of diabetes. And the way you measure it is by tracking it. So the way we diagnose normal blood sugar is in a fasting blood glucose less than 100, and an A1C, which is a measure of 3 months of average blood sugar of being less than 5.7%. When this goes above 6.5%, that's diabetes. Between 5.7 and 6.5%, that's pre-diabetes. Well, how can you, let's say whether your blood sugar, your A1C comes back at like 6 or like 6.6, what do you do? Well, first thing was if you lose weight, that will come down. How do you lose weight? Sorry, I don't mean lose weight, fat loss. You should lose fat. That's a very specific term. So you want to maintain the muscle that you have, and you want to lose fat. The way to do that would be eating more protein, eating more fiber, eating less carbs, exercising with a component of strength training, as well as moderate high intensity exercise like walking and running. If all this doesn't work, and the weight loss is harder to do, there are medications that can help. So there's a whole class of medications called SGLT2 inhibitors or GLP-1 receptor agonists. So an example of this is Jardiance or Farxiga. Examples of this include Ozempic, Wegovy. And so these are medicines that can be added on to help lose weight and ultimately bring these numbers down. Insulin is added when none of these things work. That's more of a severe stage diabetes. I've had several patients who've been on insulin where we've started these medicines on them, we've gotten them to lose weight, and they've eventually come off of insulin. And that's the ideal state. But I would say the first thing to do if you're in this area is essentially aim for fat loss. Now, how much weight is a good weight and how much is a bad weight? And so one way to help understand that is something called a body mass index. And so this is a special number that takes into account your height and your weight. So you can be tall and you're allowed to weigh more, and you can be short and you're allowed to weigh less. However, if you're short and you weigh the same amount as someone who's taller, that's unhealthy. So these are these aren't intuitive, but you have to quantify them, because just looking at someone, our vision can be off. So there are these things called body mass index calculators, and you plug in your height either in meters or in feet and inches and your weight, and it spits out a number. One thing to note is that the cutoff of what we consider healthy, obese, and overweight is different in South Asians and Asian Americans compared to everybody else. And this is in part because Asians and South Asians are at high risk of diabetes despite being skinnier. So we've lowered the cutoffs of what we consider healthy. So as an example, if someone is 5'8", so 5'8", and they weigh 180 pounds, their BMI would be 27.3. And so this person would need to lose 30 pounds to get into the healthy range, which is a BMI of about 23. So just keep that in mind. In order to be honest with yourself and actually achieve goals, you have to understand how far away you are. It's not going to be, I'm just like 5 pounds overweight or I'm like 10 pounds overweight. You have to actually quantify how much do I need to be to get down to the normal BMI for South Asians, which is 23. So you go to this website. So this is the jocelyn.org. It's a diabetes center. There's many others. but you can plug in your numbers. But the key number that you have to keep in mind is aiming for a BMI about 23 or lower. Next is cholesterol control. This tends to not be that as difficult to do because one, it can be achieved with medicines, but in general, high cholesterol tends to be less of an issue in South Asians. But just for background, high HDL is the high density lipoprotein cholesterol, is known as good cholesterol. It goes up with more physical activity. LDL cholesterol is a bad cholesterol, so this can help clog up the arteries and cause coronary artery disease. Triglycerides are a type of fat in the body. And essentially, the key is you should have your blood lipid or cholesterol checked once in your life, and then if it's high, you should continue to be checked. And this should be as early as like in your early 20s. So, if you're 21 and older, you should have this checked just to see where you are. And depending on what your age is, your doctor will calculate your risk in addition to your age and other risk factors to see if you would benefit from a cholesterol lowering medicine. And if they haven't done that already, you should bring that up with them. Okay, and then blood pressure. So blood pressure is important because very high blood pressure can damage the arteries and cause the atherosclerosis or that plaque buildup to be accelerated. Optimal blood pressure is less than 120 over 80. What we call high blood pressure is anything between 130 to 139 over the top number and 80 to 89 for the bottom number. And hypertension, so that's a diagnosis of a high blood pressure, is anything above 140 over 90. So these are important numbers to keep in mind. And the only way you know what your blood pressure is to have it checked. And if you find that you are in this or this category, I would actually recommend getting a blood pressure cuff at home and checking it at regularly and keeping a record of it. What helps in lowering blood pressure? And again, here the key thing here is weight or fat loss. Do that first. Also reduce your salt, and that can also help lower blood pressure. But some people may just have high blood pressure, whether that's hereditary or otherwise, and you just need medications to help treat it. Another major thing is quitting tobacco. There's not much more that can be said. I think this has been known for a long time. There's not really an excuse anymore. So if you're smoking, please try to quit. It takes about 7 attempts for any given person to quit tobacco. It's very hard to do, but it's very much worth it. About a third of all deaths from heart disease are explained by tobacco, and it's one of the leading causes of preventable death in the US. But more importantly, about 40% of children are exposed to secondhand smoke. So even though they may not be smoking, they're damaged by the smoke in their environment. And then the final recommendation is getting about 7 to 9 hours of sleep each night, because having a good night's sleep helps promote healing, immune function, and reduces the risk for a number of different chronic diseases and improves your mood. And so the way to do this is to set a strict bedtime, minimize screen time, and use do not disturb mode on your phone so you're not getting messages late at night. So outside of these lifestyle interventions, what else can we do as a community or as a group to help understand and prevent heart disease in the South Asian community? So as I said before, South Asians make up about a quarter of the world population, but about only 1%, 1.3% of all genetic studies. And if you look at all the clinical trials that have been done, so these are those trials where you test a drug versus a placebo in a randomized controlled trial, only about 3% of the participants in those trials are South Asian, even though, again, a quarter of the world population. And so we at Mass General, at Broad and these other institutions have come together to start a cohort called the Our Health Study. And so the Our Health Study is a virtual recruited cohort of South Asians residing in the US, where we want to get people from all across the United States, across all age groups, all religions, all demographics of South Asia, and have them fill out questionnaires, send a saliva sample so we can get some genetic information. And our goal is to design a very large cohort so that we can study these sorts of genetic differences that are inherent to South Asians in a more scientific manner. Up until now, we have actually very small, the Masala study is a famous one where there's only 1,000 participants that enrolled. They're looking to expand, but we need on the order of tens to hundreds of thousands of people to be able to have meaningful results in these sorts of genetic and epidemiologic studies. And so we're in the process of recruiting more people to join this study. The website is called ourhealth.org, and anyone living in the United States can join. You have to be at least 18 and be comfortable filling out surveys in English, or have someone who could help you fill them out if you don't personally speak English. And you should be of South Asian ancestry. which is designated as individuals who are from Bangladesh, Bhutan, India, the Maldives, Nepal, Pakistan, or Sri Lanka. And the first step is you answer the eligibility questions after you log into the website. We go through the whole consent process. You can decide if you want to join or not. You answer questions about yourself and your health, including what medications you take, if you've been diagnosed with anything, what you do in terms of what you eat, how much you exercise, just to get some demographic information so we could conduct these sorts of studies like we did with the UK Biobank. And then provide an address so we can send you a kit where you can give a saliva sample so we can then do genetic analyses to see how genetics are linked to heart disease. All of this is done in a de-identified process. So after you sign up, your information is essentially your name and all that are stripped from the information, and we assign a study ID, and that's how we do the analysis, so that there's a big privacy in place between identity and then the study subject. And in addition to actually doing the study, we aim to provide culturally specific, tailored kind of South Asian resources for education. Because as you know, if you recall that My Plate example, it was kind of a generic overall American recommendation. How do we translate that into, like a traditional South Indian meal or traditional like Punjabi meal? And so we want to be able to give both culturally specific healthy recommendations, as well as recommendations in South Asian languages. So not in English, but translated into other languages. And so those are the kinds of things that we will be doing as part of education in addition to the actual scientific study. So if you're interested, this is the QR code to sign up for this study. You can also go into our website, which is ourhealthstudy.org. And then our email is info@ourhealthstudy.org. And you can also follow us on Twitter or X, Instagram, or Facebook. So that's all I had in terms of presentation, and I'm happy to answer any sort of questions that anyone may have.
So if somebody is 4'11", they should only be weighing less than 95 pounds to be in the 23 BMI.
Did you plug it into the calculator?
Yeah.
Let's see. 4'11". No, that's too low.
I thought you said 23.
Yeah, so I'm plugging in 4'11". That's 114 pounds is 23 BMI.
Okay. Thank you.
That was a really thorough presentation, so I'm struggling to think of questions. But one that was on my mind was, I know you said South Asians are underrepresented in research studies for cardiovascular health. So I was just wondering, like, how are people picked for those research studies in general?
Yeah, they are generally approached either if they're hospitalized for a heart attack or something, then people and depending on what hospital they are, the patient is given permission to be approached, and then they go through whatever process, and then they either agree or don't agree. That's why, but that can be varied. Like if a given hospital doesn't have that study, and that's where a lot of South Asians go, that could be a problem. So that's where we're trying to go directly to the community, as in doing a virtual recruitment with this study, so that anyone who wants to sign up can kind of do it. It's not, you don't need to be hospitalized or in part of a specific clinic or anything like that. And so we're kind of democratizing that aspect a little bit more. But generally, yes, it is based on kind of a couple of study sites are designated by like Novartis or some sort of large pharmaceutical company, and that's where if you live in that area or then catchment, then you may be approached. So it could be related to that, but I think depending on language barrier or other things, if a family member is enrolled and they may not understand what's being asked of them, or there's something lost in translation, these are some potential barriers as to why they're not being enrolled. But I think that's also, in the United States, South Asians make up a smaller chunk of the population, but what we were recording was actually global. So even though studies are being done in the US or being done in China, they're not being done in India. They're not being done in like Pakistan or Bangladesh. And the same drugs are being marketed there. And so I guess we're trying to make the case that, yes, it may be that 3% of the people in US-based clinical trials are South Asian. That's representative because we make up less than 5% of the population here. Globally, that number should be much higher. And so how can we help, increase those numbers, whether that's actually getting the companies to show that their medicines work in India or other countries like that, or recruiting more South Asians here.
Yeah, definitely. I'll also ask my family to do your study because I know that's really important. I'm almost 18 soon, so yeah, I'll try it out.
Yeah, and I think like we're happy to answer any questions regarding what all the details are, and you can fill out as much as you want or stop at any point in time. And what we consider a full participation is filling out all the surveys and then sending back the saliva kit, and then we'll send like more updates as we learn more. But yeah, we're in the recruitment process. I think we have about like 700 people or so already enrolled. We just started this earlier in the year, and we're hoping to get to 10,000 first and then keep on expanding. But as I said, like the largest genome-wide association study for heart disease is 1.2 million people, and that's the level of numbers you need to be able to make definitive conclusions. And our goal is, in studying South Asians, we want to be very scientific, not make a bunch of assumptions or do kind of dinner table conversations, because that's unfortunately where a lot of this sort of speculation has been. But we want to be much more scientific and get real answers. And so in order to do that, we need people, we need large amounts of people. And that's why we're doing it, where we're doing virtual recruitment and going out to different communities and talking about it.
So if you sign up for the research, do you have to follow a lot of protocol, or?
There's no protocol. It's just the surveys and then the saliva kit. That's the protocol. So when you sign up, we will send a link to the survey. It's a website, and then you can fill them out at your leisure. There's like different modules, like one is on lifestyle, one is on diet, that kind of thing. And then you can fill as many of those out as you want in order. And then once those are completed, we will send a saliva kit where it's mailed to you. You swab your cheek and then you mail it back, and then that's it. And then the future, so after that, we'll give updates in terms of the educational materials, additional sub studies that we're doing. But it's not like we're saying you do this or you do that. There's no intervention. It's just a collection of kind of epidemiologic data.
Okay, thank you.
But our hope is that once we have a large collection of people, and we can answer more those basic questions, like what diet is associated with it, or what in what medications work better in the South Asian population, collecting blood pressure, that sort of thing. We'll have a large group of people who are willing to participate in more studies. Then we can potentially be like, hey, X clinical trial, we have, instead of trying to go and recruit at all these different places, we already have a database of people who are willing and wanting to participate. If you have a new trial drug or something like that, then we can say we can give you like an option, like, do you want to be approached or not? So it could kind of be a gateway to being a participant in more trials. But our specific study is not a trial; it's just a collection of information.
Mm-hmm.
And yes, the age.
Should a pre-diabetic be on medication?
I think a pre-diabetic should focus on weight loss.
Okay, thank you.
The study is all like, we're recruiting now. There's no endpoint. We will essentially follow along, and we are going in the initial studies. We basically ask, like, have you had a heart attack, or have you had diabetes, or whatever. We'll have follow-up studies where you say, let's say in a year or two, have you developed any new conditions as a study? And that's how we follow you. And we just kind of follow until you decide you don't want to participate anymore, or indefinitely. So there's not an end point. And then the age cutoff is 18 and above. That's the only cutoff. And so, for example, UK Biobank is a similar study. It started in 2000. and it has a 500,000 people. It's still ongoing, and so the results I reported were after 11 years of follow-up. Now I think there's like 14 or 15 years of follow-up. So similarly in our study, let's say in 5 years, if you participate, we would report collectively on like the results at 5-year mark, 10-year mark, depending on how many people are still in the study. It'd be a different number, but it's not a start and end date, and there's also no intervention. It's just collection of information and collection of future information in an anonymized fashion.
Would you happen to have digital versions of the information you were talking about that's handed out about diet and everything in English that you could share with us?
You mean the American Heart Association Essential 8?
Yeah, that as well
Yeah.
as the one you showed with the thali. Do you have something
Oh,
already?
the myplate.org.
Mhm.
Yeah, so that's a website. I can just post the link here.
Okay, great. And does this study have any educational materials you can share with our group?
So far, let me just say, I think we have a whole page of all of this. So I'll post that here as well. They're on the tab now.
Thank you. Any other questions? No?
Thank you so much, Dr. Patel, for such an insightful and engaging presentation. Your discussion on cardiovascular risks in the South Asian population, the role of genetics and ethnicity, and the importance of prevention strategies was very informative. We truly appreciate your time and expertise in shedding light on such an important health issue, and we look forward to applying the knowledge you've shared to promote better heart health in our communities.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Bye.
All right, I'll end the meeting now. Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.